interesting and a unique topic, especially with regards to the obesity in children.
In our body, we have got energy which is in the kinetic form, which we are utilizing for the various functions, or we store largely in the form of fat, which is the best way to store energy. And the overall homeostatic situation decides whether we are more towards storing or using the stored energy. So in situations of stability, there would be a greater adipogenesis, in which there will be more fat which is being deposited as a marker of energy, while in deprivation there would be the utilization of that energy. So in a way, when we talk about obesity, we typically talk about obesity as an increased adiposity state. It is in an essence an increased energy state. So we've got more energy, or the stored energy or the static energy, which is basically in the form of fat, is more, and that's what essentially is obesity. So if we now look at obesity from an energy perspective, we have discussed that energy stores are largely reflected via the body fat in the body, and they will depend upon how much energy we are getting, which is largely in the form of food intake, which may be as part of what is known as homeostatic or a survival mode food intake for pleasure, which happens because of hedonistic control, and very importantly related to stress, which is mediated via cortisol. Now, all of these will provide us with a positive energy balance, which is then spent out in the form of the resting energy expenditure, which is largely determined by the lean body mass, physical activity, which could be structured and non-structured physical activity, and finally diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the amount of energy which is really being spent when we are digesting or utilizing a particular nutrient. So the overall energy balance therefore represents the balance between the intake and the expenditure. Now, if we talk about pathophysiology from a genetic perspective, obesity can happen if there is more intake or decreased expenditure. A vast majority of conditions which are associated with genetic obesity are associated with increased intake rather than reduced expenditure, with the exception of the KRAS pathway, which is a very rare phenomena in which the expenditure is actually low. The reason for that is that while the scope of increasing intake is huge, you cannot really cut down the resting energy expenditure or a basic physical activity in that perspective. Now, the overall energy levels in the bodies are sensed via a marker produced from the adipocyte, leptin, which is a marker of the overall body fat and the body energy status. And the way humans have evolved, it is mainly towards prevention of starvation. So the main thing that the body wants to regulate is to avoid a fall in leptin. Every individual, based upon the genetic predisposition, based upon the fat content, based upon the environment, will have a particular leptin level. And as soon as the leptin level goes below a particular threshold of that individual, it will really trigger an overall phenomena as to what is quote unquote named as the starvation response. Essentially, the body will say, okay, whatever happens, if the leptin falls below this, we have to conserve energy. We have to eat more, we have to spend less energy, and is this starvation mechanism also will then shut down the processes which require a lot of energy, like growth, like development, like thyroid function, like bone health, like puberty and reproduction. And therefore, leptin deficiency or a relative fall in leptin level is a major stimulus which will really conserve energy, and that may really offset a lot of benefits which happens with nutritional deprivation, as we'll discuss subsequently in that regard. Now, if we look at the holistic picture of energy regulation, essentially this is all done at the level of the mediobasal hypothalamus, which is the major area which processes the entire information about the energy status, the food intake, and the other aspects of the body. And this involves a number of nuclei, including the ventromedial hypothalamus, the arcuate region, very important, the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is being terminated via a vagal nerve. And essentially, within this processing units, there are two groups of neurons which are very, very close to each other. The anorexic group of neurons, which are essentially the pro-opium-melanocortin, and the CART group of neurons, which are essentially stimulated in energy excess situation, wherein they decrease the energy intake, the food intake, while increasing energy expenditure. And the orexogenic neuron, essentially the neuropeptide Y and AGRP, which are essentially the opposite of anorexic. They are stimulated in situations wherein there is energy is less. They increase dietary intake while inhibiting the energy expenditure in that regards. Now, this entire central processing unit gets information from the periphery from multiple signals, which include a combination of neuro, endo, nutritional signals, along with the long-term status as far as the adiposity status via leptin. So the major short-term afferents will include how much the stomach is stretched. This information comes from the vagus. The release of hormones from the stomach once the stomach is empty, namely ghrelin. The release of nutrients from the food, which will then tell us that, okay, there's enough to eat, energy levels, and then as the food passes from the stomach to the duodenum, to the intestine, to the pancreas, number of other factors start to produce, including GLP-1, peptide Y, cholecystokinin, insulin, amylin, oxyntomodulin, and these are all afferent signals which are essentially telling the body that there is a reasonable status of nutrition which is there, and we need to stimulate the anorexic pathway, stop eating, spend more energy in that regards. Now, the long-term level of the overall energy status is determined via the leptin, which is produced by the adipocytes, and this again tells us from a long modulatory function as to how the energy status are. Higher adipocyte level, higher leptin will indicate anorexic signals, less eating, more spending, low level of fat, low level of leptin, or rather a decline in leptin, a decline in fat will indicate inhibition of the anorexic signaling, advising more to eat and less to spend in that regards. Now, the efferent signal are largely neurological in the form of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system, which regulate how much energy is being spent with regards to the muscular activity, with regards to thyroid regulation, with regards to adipogenesis. And it is this complex interplay between the afferent signals, which include the neurochemical and nutritional signals, the central processing unit, which is basically the opposing yin-yang anorexic and orexogenic pathway, and the efferent signals, which determines the overall energy status of a particular individual. The major determinant of energy intake of an individual and the major cause of obesity in a clinical setting is the amount of food which is taken by an individual. Now, this food intake could be part of a normal homeostatic mechanism which is driven by the energy status and the nutrient status of an individual, determined by the energy markers, but there can be other factors also which regulate the food intake. These include the response of food intake in response to pleasure activity, which is largely regulated via the behavioral region, the mesocorticolimbic area, mainly via the opioid and the dopamine pathway. Stress-induced eating, very, very important, particularly in children nowadays, because of the amygdala response, and regulated largely via cortisol, and of course via social clues, which include the vision, the smell, and the palatability of a particular food, which helps in that regards. Now, while homeostatic mechanism is one which is actually linked to energy status, the one which is hedonic or pleasure or stress or social is unrelated, and this is an important factor to consider in that setting. Food intake is in itself a very, very important factor and is regulated at multiple levels. as soon as there is a smell or sight or sensation or even anticipation of food, the brain starts working differently. And this is very important because hunger is one of the most aversive situation an individual will like to be in. So if somebody is hungry, there are a lot of mechanisms which are stimulated which have got a negative connotation. But as soon as that individual will even think of food, see food, smell it, or taste it, even before anything has happened, the sensation will change. And this is very, very important when we talk about the phases of eating, that is the hunger, satiation, and satiety. So the cephalic part is also very, very important in that just the perception that the food intake will happen would be a positive thing which happens in avoiding hunger response. The other, of course, factors are the actual nutrient status. So in the situations wherein the food is taken, the stomach gets distended, the neurochemical output which comes from the stomach will say, okay, we have enough and we can now probably decrease food intake. This is the gastric phase, mainly via digestion, vagal stimulus, and ghrelin inhibition. Subsequent to that, there will be, when the food reaches the intestine, it will then release other substances like GLP-1 and neuropeptide Y, which will regulate the food. So the food intake essentially is a dynamic process which involves phases of hunger, which is a negative phenomena, which is immediately satiated as soon as it's been taken care of, followed by a period in which there is decreased need for hunger of food in what is known as satiety. So if you talk about food cycle in that perspective, there are episodes in which an individual eats, and this is pretty much the hunger. The major driving force for this hunger is the ghrelin level, which is essentially secreted when the stomach is empty, and this will result along with the low anorexic signal. So when the leptin goes down, ghrelin goes up, the individual becomes really, really hungry. Now, as soon as the hunger starts, as discussed, the food cycle will start right from the cephalic phase. So even the smell of food, even the sight of food, even the thought of food may start a process which will say, okay, hunger can take care of it. And this starts the phase of satiation. And the major factor which regulates satiation include a reduction in ghrelin because the nutrient comes to the stomach. The stomach is distended, so the vagus now gets stimulated and satiation starts. Once this process goes forward, there is release from the pancreas, from the intestine, which will then say, okay, now we have enough and we need to be satiated. Now, next very important component is, of course, the satiety, which is the gap between two episodes of eating. It will depend upon the meal composition, the gut microbiota, and a number of the factors, particularly the POMC, the leptin, the MSH pathway. So if we now talk about food intake, which is the major determinant of energy regulation, the major determinant of overall energy intake is actually how much is an individual satiated. So hunger is a phenomena which can be very easily overcome as soon as you get all those factors which suppress ghrelin. But how long an individual remains satiated is an important factor. And in this situation, the anorexic pathways play a major role. So if we now talk about the pathophysiology of obesity and genetic obesity in particular, it's easy to understand as to how the major problem is in terms of food intake and not energy expenditure. And within food intake, it is the lack of satiety which is the major factor. So if we talk about the entirety of genetic obesity, which we'll discuss subsequently, most of them will lie in that leptin receptor, POMC, MSH, MC34, MC4R, brain-derived neurotrophic factor and its receptor, which are essentially in the satiety group. So it's the satiety which becomes very, very important, but our overall understanding of hunger, its regulation and control are also absolutely important.